The first time Delia Slater left soup on Stephen Garrison's doorstep, she told herself it was nothing more than neighborly charity, and she almost believed it. It was the autumn of 1874, deep in the sprawling hill country of central Texas, where the town of Harlan Creek clung to the banks of a shallow limestone river like a vine gripping the side of a weathered fence post. The town was small enough that everyone knew who had lost what and when, and Delia had lost plenty. Her husband, Caleb Slater, had been dead 11 months by the time that first cold snap rolled down from the north and rattled the shutters of every modest homestead along the creek. 11 months of learning to haul her own firewood and mend her own fences and explain to her 7-year-old son, Thomas, why Papa was not coming back from the south pasture. 11 months of neighbors offering casseroles and condolences until both ran dry, leaving her to figure out the quieter, harder kind of survival that nobody talks about at funerals. Stephen Garrison had moved into the old Breck property in late September, 6 weeks before the first frost painted the mesquite trees silver. Nobody in Harlan Creek knew much about him except that he had paid for the land outright, in cash, which was enough to earn a man both respect and suspicion in equal measure in that particular corner of Texas. He had arrived alone with a buckboard wagon loaded with tools and very little else, and he had gotten straight to work on the collapsed roof of the farmhouse without introducing himself to a single soul. The town watched him from a polite distance and whispered over their fences about where a man that quiet might have come from and what kind of trouble might be following behind him. Delia lived a quarter-mile to the east, close enough that she could see the smoke from his chimney on still mornings, and far enough that she had no practical reason to go over there at all. She had Thomas to feed, and a small kitchen garden that was barely keeping them through the winter, and 3 hens who laid with maddening inconsistency, and a milk cow named Agnes who had opinions about everything. She did not have time to concern herself with the silent man rebuilding the Breck house. But then November arrived, and with it came a sickness that moved through Harlan Creek like a slow fire. It started with old Mercer at the livery stable and worked its way down both sides of Main Street, a chest sickness that the doctor called catarrhal fever and that everyone else just called the misery. Thomas caught a mild version of it and recovered in 4 days with nothing worse than a runny nose and a tremendous appetite for warm cornbread. Delia herself never caught it at all. But she began to notice, watching from her kitchen window in the gray afternoons, that no smoke rose from the chimney of the Breck property. For 2 days she told herself it was none of her business. On the 3rd day she put on her coat. She made the soup from a ham bone she had been saving and dried beans and turnips from the garden, with a good handful of dried sage and a bay leaf that she had gotten from the mercantile back in the spring. She let it simmer for 2 hours until the broth was rich and golden, and the beans had softened into something deeply satisfying, and she ladled it into her best covered crock, the blue-painted one that had belonged to her mother. She wrapped the crock in a dish towel to keep it warm, and she walked the quarter-mile across the November grass with Thomas trotting at her side asking questions she did not fully answer. She had told herself, the whole walk over, that she would knock, that she would ask after the man, see whether he needed the doctor fetched, do the decent thing the way any neighbor would. But when she got to the door of the Breck house, which Stephen Garrison had already repaired so well that it sat perfectly plumb in its frame, she heard something through the weathered wood that stopped her hand before it could form a fist. It was the sound of a man coughing, deep and raw and somehow dignified in its restraint, the sound of someone who had decided a long time ago not to make noise about his suffering and was keeping to that decision even in private. Something about that stopped her completely. She set the crock on the doorstep with careful hands. She set it where the overhang would keep the morning dew off the lid. She straightened up, looked at the closed door for one long moment, and then she took Thomas by the hand and walked home without knocking. She did not know exactly why she made that choice. Later, she would think that it had something to do with the sound of that cough, with the particular privacy of a man who was clearly not going to ask for help no matter how badly he needed it, and how knocking might have forced him to either let her in or turn her away, and either one of those felt like an intrusion on something she could not name. It was easier, somehow, to simply offer the soup and let him decide what to do with it. She found out what he decided the next morning. She woke before Thomas, the way she always did, and put her coat on over her nightgown to go check on Agnes. The morning was pale gray and bitterly cold, the kind of cold that turns breath into small clouds and makes the frozen grass crunch underfoot like broken glass. She was halfway to the barn when she noticed something on her own doorstep that had not been there the night before. She walked to the door in the slow, careful way of someone who is trying not to hope for something specific, and she looked down. Firewood, a full, generous armload of split oak, stacked with a neatness that suggested the person who stacked it had taken their time. Not the scruffy, hastily broken scraps that she sometimes managed to split herself, but properly seasoned oak split clean and square and dry, the kind that would burn for hours. On top of the stack sat her blue crock, which had been washed and dried and returned with a care that made her chest ache in a way she had not expected. There was no note, no knock, no explanation. She stood on her doorstep in the freezing November morning and stared at that pile of wood for a long time, and then she picked up her crock and held it against her chest like it was something precious, which she supposed it was, and she went inside. Thomas was awake by then, sitting at the kitchen table with his hair standing up in every direction and his boots already on, because he always put his boots on first thing the way Caleb had done. "Mama," he said, looking at the crock in her hands with the direct, uncomplicated curiosity of a 7-year-old. "Where did the wood come from?" "The neighbor," Delia said, and that was all she said, but she stood at the kitchen window for a long moment and looked east toward the Breck property, and she could see that the chimney was smoking again. She told herself she was glad he was feeling better. She told herself that was the only thing she felt. She was not entirely convincing, even to herself. The second time she left soup, it was 3 weeks later and completely intentional, though she spent a good deal of effort pretending otherwise. She had made a large pot of venison stew, more than she and Thomas could reasonably eat, because she had traded a week's worth of eggs for a piece of venison from Tom Hadley at the butcher's shop, and the piece had turned out to be larger than she had expected. That was her reason, and it was a perfectly good one. She simply had extra. It would be wasteful not to share it. She went at dusk this time alone because Thomas was already asleep. The sky over Harlan Creek was a deep, bruised purple, the last light of day dying behind the western hills, and the air smelled of wood smoke and cold earth and the faraway sweetness of cedar. She carried the crock in both hands and walked quietly across the winter grass, and when she reached the Breck house she stood for a moment and listened. No coughing this time. Through the thin wall she could hear the faint, rhythmic sound of movement, of tools perhaps, of someone working in the last of the light or by lamplight. The chimney was smoking steadily. Everything about the house looked solid and cared for in a way it hadn't looked 2 months ago. She set the crock on the doorstep. She walked home. The next morning she found on her own doorstep not just firewood but something extra, 3 fence posts, freshly cut and trimmed, standing upright against the side of her house exactly where her front garden fence had been rotting and sagging since last spring. He had clearly noticed. He had clearly walked over far enough to look. She stood very still looking at those fence posts, feeling something warm and complicated move through her like a slow tide. Thomas appeared at her elbow without warning, as children do. "More wood," he announced. "And fence posts," Delia said. Thomas considered this with great seriousness. "We should give him pie," he said. "We should mind our own business," Delia told him, but her voice came out softer than she intended, and Thomas looked up at her with Caleb's dark eyes and said nothing, which was somehow worse than arguing. She did not leave pie, but she noticed over the following days that she began paying closer attention to the smoke from that chimney. She noticed when it went dark early, which might mean he had turned in, and when it burned high and steady, which meant he was working late. She noticed the tracks his horse left in the frost when he rode past on the road to town, because she could tell his horse's hoofprints from any other, a slightly heavier stamp on the left foreleg, as if the horse favored it slightly. She noticed these things and told herself she was not noticing them. December came. The cold deepened and the days shortened until the afternoon light was thin as paper, and Harlan Creek went about the serious business of surviving winter the way it always had, with preserved food and heavy quilts and long evenings around the fire. Delia kept her small house as warm as she could with the oak wood that appeared on her doorstep at irregular intervals, always split cleanly, always stacked neatly. She left soup every 10 days or so, always in the blue crock, always covered, always set carefully on the step that Stephen Garrison had repaired sometime in late November so that it sat perfectly level and no longer shed splinters onto the porch floor. She had still not seen his face. She had heard him once, at a distance, speaking to someone at the mercantile in town. She had been inside getting flour when the door opened and a voice said, "I will take 2 pounds of dried beans and a tin of lamp oil," and something about the directness of it, the economy of it, made her look up. But she had only seen his back, broad shoulders under a worn canvas coat, dark hair curling slightly over the collar, a hat pulled low. He had paid, thanked the man behind the counter, and left, and by the time Delia had gathered herself enough to follow casually, there was nothing to see but the hitching post where his horse had been and a set of prints in the cold mud. The first time they actually spoke was because of Agnes. It was a Monday in the middle of December, cold and bright, the sky a hard blue over the hills, and Agnes had gotten through the fence again. Delia did not know how Agnes managed it every single time, because the fence looked perfectly adequate in all the ways she could measure. But the cow had some gift for finding the particular weakness in whatever barrier was presented to her, and walking through it with calm determination, the way some people do. Delia came out of the house at mid-morning to find Agnes standing in the middle of the road looking pleased with herself, and Thomas standing on the porch informing the cow, with great authority, that she was in serious trouble. Delia grabbed the lead rope from the barn and went out to collect Agnes, who was cooperative up until the moment she decided not to be, and then the two of them were having a quiet disagreement in the middle of the frozen road when a horse and rider came around the bend from the east. He pulled up at a respectful distance, reading the situation in the fast, accurate way of a man accustomed to taking stock of things quickly. He swung down from the saddle without being asked, tied his horse to the nearest fence post, and walked toward Agnes with the easy, unhurried confidence of a man who had dealt with uncooperative animals before. "May I?" he said. It was barely a question. Delia looked up at him, and it was the first time she had seen his face. He was perhaps 32 or 33, she guessed, lean and weathered in the way that men who work outside get weathered, not old but thoroughly seasoned, with dark eyes that were steady and attentive, and held a kind of careful reserve that she recognized immediately, because she had spent 11 months cultivating the same thing in herself. There was a scar along the left side of his jaw, faded to silver, and his hands, when he took the lead rope from her without ceremony, were big and were cruffined and completely capable. He walked up to Agnes and spoke to her in a low voice that Delia could not quite hear, and Agnes, to Delia's absolute indignation, went immediately quiet and docile and allowed herself to be led back through the gate as if there had never been any dispute at all. Stephen Garrison looped the rope through the gate latch, checked it, and turned to face her. "She leans into the gate rather than pushing it," he said. "You need the latch on the other side." Delia looked at the gate. She looked at him. "I see," she said, which was not brilliant, but it was all she had. "I can fix it," he said. "You have already fixed a great deal," she said before she thought about it, and then heat came up into her face because she had not meant to acknowledge all of it, the firewood and the fence posts and all the other small repairs she had noticed appearing without explanation. He looked at her steadily for a moment. He had, she thought, the kind of face that did not give much away and yet somehow gave everything away, all at once in the quality of his silence. "It seemed fair," he said quietly. She understood that he meant the soup. She understood also that he was not a man who spent words carelessly, that each one he used had been thought about before it left him, and that this particular sentence was carrying considerably more weight than its 3 words suggested. "I am Delia Slater," she said. "I know," he said. "Stephen Garrison." "I know," she said. They looked at each other for a moment in the cold December road, and then Thomas came flying off the porch and skidded to a stop in front of Stephen Garrison with the complete lack of social inhibition that is the privilege of 7-year-olds. "Did you leave the wood?" he demanded. "Thomas," Delia said. "Yes," Stephen Garrison said, unruffled. "Why?" Thomas asked. Stephen Garrison looked at the boy with that same steady attention he seemed to give everything. "Because your mother left me soup," he said, "and I had wood." Thomas appeared to find this entirely satisfactory. "She makes good soup," he said. "Yes," Stephen Garrison said. "She does." He looked at Delia when he said it, and she looked away at the frozen hills and tried to remember how to breathe properly. He fixed the gate latch that same afternoon. She heard the hammer from inside the house and stayed very busy at the kitchen table teaching Thomas his letters until the sound stopped, and then she looked out the window and saw him walking back across the grass toward his own property, his coat dark against the pale winter hills. She made pie that evening. She told herself it was because she had extra apples. She left it on his doorstep after dark in her best pie pan, covered with a cloth. She knocked that time. She did it without thinking, her knuckles on the door before she had given herself permission, and then she stood there in the cold dark with her heart hammering, and when she heard footsteps inside, she turned and walked rapidly back across the grass and did not stop until she was safely in her own house with the door shut behind her. She leaned against the door and pressed the back of her hand to her mouth and told herself she was being ridiculous. The pie pan was returned the next morning with a small bundle of dried sage tied with a bit of twine, and she held the sage and the empty pan and smiled at the wall of her kitchen for so long that Thomas started to look at her with mild concern. The winter thickened into January, which in central Texas meant days of brilliant, merciless cold alternating with days of warm southern wind that confused the mesquite trees into thinking spring had come before it had. The town of Harlan Creek went on about its business, and the business of Harlan Creek included, as it always had, a certain amount of talk about who was doing what and to whom and why. And by January it had not escaped the notice of certain people, specifically Mabel Hadley, who ran the post office out of her husband's butcher shop, that the new man out at the Breck property and the Slater widow had developed some kind of arrangement involving crockery and firewood. Mabel was not a malicious woman, but she was a thorough one, and she mentioned what she had observed to Reverend Cross's wife, and from there it traveled to 4 other women in the time it takes to braid hair. And by the second week of January Delia was receiving the kind of careful, sidelong attention from her neighbors that she recognized as interest poorly disguised as concern. "He seems a decent sort," said Clara Whitmore, who operated the small schoolhouse where Thomas had begun attending in the fall, and who appeared entirely without warning at Delia's kitchen table on a Thursday morning with a tin of ginger snaps that was clearly a pretense. "Garrison, I mean." "I expect he is," Delia said, pouring coffee with a steadiness she was proud of. "No one knows much about where he came from," Clara said, helping herself to a ginger snap with the brisk air of someone who has decided to be direct. "He was in the war, some say, Union Army, which I mention only because I know some folks in town have opinions about that, and I want you to know I am not among them." Delia set the coffee pot down and looked at Clara Whitmore with clear eyes. "He has been nothing but a good neighbor," she said. "That is all I have to say about it." Clara nodded, satisfied with more than Delia had intended to give her. "Of course," she said, and ate another ginger snap and stayed for another 40 minutes. After she left, Delia sat at the kitchen table and thought about what Clara had said. She had gathered from small observations that Stephen Garrison had been a soldier. The way he moved suggested it, the economy of his steps, the habit of positioning himself so he could see a room's entrance, the way he scanned the horizon when he rode. She had not asked. She had learned, over these weeks of doorstep exchanges and that one brief conversation in the road, that he was a man who would share what he chose to share, and that pressing him for more would be both ineffective and unkind. She thought about what it might cost a man to fight in a war that divided the state he lived in, and then to come out the other side of it and try to make something quiet in the same land where people were still choosing sides 8 years on. She thought about the way he worked on his house alone, every day, without asking for help, and she recognized something in that which she could not entirely explain, except to say that she had spent 11 months doing the same thing, and she understood the particular dignity of it. She left him soup again that Friday. She added a good measure of black pepper and a pinch of dried chili because the weather had turned wet and cold, and she left it at dusk and walked home quickly in the gray drizzle. She was nearly to her own door when she heard his voice behind her, and she stopped so suddenly she nearly stumbled. "Mrs. Slater," she turned. He was standing on his own porch, which was 40 yards away, and his voice carried clearly through the still, wet air. "Thank you," he said. It was not a dramatic statement. It was not an eloquent one. But the way he said it, standing there in the early dark with the rain beginning to mist around him, with that careful steadiness that was, she had come to understand, not coldness but something much more like held feeling, made the words land somewhere deep in her chest where she was not entirely prepared for them. "You are welcome," she called back, and her voice came out steady, which she counted as a victory. She went inside. She stood at the window for a moment and looked out at the dark and the rain. Thomas appeared at her elbow. "Was that him?" he said. "Yes," she said. "You should invite him for supper," Thomas said, with the infuriating simplicity of a child who had not yet learned that things between adults are complicated. "Go wash your hands," Delia said. But later that night, after Thomas was asleep and the rain was tapping at the window and the fire was burning low, she sat in her chair by the hearth and thought about what it would be like to have another person at the table, to hear another voice in the house after Thomas was asleep, to sit across from someone and not have to hold everything up by herself for a little while. She missed Caleb. She missed him in the complicated way that was not entirely about Caleb himself, but about what having a partner meant, about the simple, profound luxury of being known by someone. Caleb had been a good man. He had not been a particularly romantic one. They had married young, 18 each of them, in 1866, the year after the war ended when the whole country was trying to figure out how to be itself again. And their marriage had been built on practical affection and shared work and genuine friendship, and Thomas, who had been born in 1867 and had changed both of them completely. Caleb had been killed by a horse that kicked at the wrong moment on a hot afternoon in December 1873, and the unfairness of it, the absolute mundane unfairness of it, had been something Delia had spent 11 months slowly learning to carry. She was not looking for someone to replace Caleb. She did not think such a thing was possible or even desirable. But sitting by the fire in the rain-dark house, she let herself think for just a moment about the steadiness of Stephen Garrison's dark eyes and the careful way he handled things, crockery and gate latches and lead ropes and thanks, as if everything deserved to be handled with intention, and she felt something in her chest that was tentative and warm and frightening and very much alive. She banked the fire and went to bed and told herself firmly to go to sleep. It took a while. The invitation came from Thomas, as it turned out, and not from Delia at all, which was both a relief and an embarrassment. It happened at the Mercantile in the second week of January, when Delia had brought Thomas along to pick up a few supplies, and they encountered Stephen Garrison at the counter buying lamp oil and nails, and Thomas, who had been nursing his own agenda for several weeks, looked up at the man with complete directness and said, Would you like to come to Sunday supper? Delia closed her eyes briefly. Stephen Garrison looked down at Thomas with an expression she couldn't quite read, something that might have been the beginning of a smile in a man who was not accustomed to smiling. "That is your mother's invitation to make," he said. Thomas turned to Delia with an air of having solved the problem. Delia looked at Stephen Garrison. He looked back at her. The mercantile was very quiet. "Sunday," she said, "if you are free." "I am free," he said. He came on Sunday. He arrived at 6 o'clock, exactly when she had said supper would be ready, which told her something. He came to the door, and this time he knocked, 3 measured knocks, and she opened it, and for a moment they simply looked at each other in the lamplight, and there was something in that moment that felt significant in a way she couldn't justify. He had brought something, a small jar of honey. He held it out without much preamble. "From bees," he said, which was self-evident, and then he seemed to realize it was self-evident, and something shifted in his expression that she thought, with a small internal delight, might be embarrassment. "Thank you," she said carefully, and stepped back to let him in. He took off his hat at the door and stood in her kitchen, and looked at it the way he seemed to look at everything, with that quiet, cataloging attention, taking in the hanging herbs and the good cast-iron stove, and the colored glass bottles on the windowsill that caught the lamplight and threw small jewels of color across the wall. He looked at these things and said nothing, but his expression said that he approved, which was all she needed. Thomas attached himself to Stephen Garrison's side with the unsubtle magnetism of a boy who had been without a man's company for nearly a year, and was intensely curious about what such company offered. He asked questions at a rate that would have exhausted most adults, about the horse, about the house repairs, about whether Stephen Garrison knew how to rope cattle, about a particular bird he had seen near the creek and could not identify. Stephen Garrison answered each question with the same serious attention he gave everything, and Delia watched from the stove and felt something quietly expand in her chest. Supper was roasted chicken, which had cost her one of her laying hens but which she had decided was worth it, with boiled sweet potatoes and the last of the fall's dried beans and a good cornbread. And for dessert the honey went on leftover biscuits, and Thomas declared this to be the best supper in living memory. Stephen Garrison ate with the quiet concentration of a man who appreciated good food and did not take it for granted, and he said, when the plates were mostly cleared, "This is very good, Mrs. Slater," in that straightforward way of his, and she believed him completely. They talked over supper, carefully at first and then less so. He told her he had grown up in Kentucky, the son of a farmer, that he had indeed served in the Union Army from 1862 to 1865 as a cavalry sergeant, that he had come to Texas afterward because the land was cheap, and he had wanted somewhere to build something from the beginning. He said this last part with a quiet emphasis that she understood was not just about the farmhouse. She told him about growing up in this same county, the daughter of a schoolteacher who had believed that girls needed to know mathematics and Latin as well as how to put up preserves, about marrying Caleb at 18, about Thomas, who was the center of her entire world and also frequently the bane of her existence. He listened the way he did everything completely, and she found herself saying more than she had planned to say, drawn out by the quality of his attention. After supper Thomas fell asleep on the settle by the fire, which he did sometimes when he had talked himself to exhaustion, and Stephen Garrison and Delia sat across from each other at the cleared table with their coffee, and the house was very quiet except for the fire and the child's soft breathing. "I heard your cough," she said into the quiet. He looked at her. "The first time," she said, "when I left the soup, I heard you through the door and I did not knock because you sounded as if you preferred privacy." Something moved across his face that she could not entirely name. "You were right," he said slowly. "I was not sure," she said. "I almost knocked anyway." "I am glad you did not," he said, and then he seemed to consider this further and added, "and glad you left it." "It was only soup," she said. "No," he said quietly. "It was not only soup." She looked at him across the table in the lamplight and the firelight with Thomas asleep in the background and the honey jar sitting between them, and she thought, "This is a moment. This is one of those moments that, looked back on from some later vantage point, will mark a before and after." She thought this clearly and without panic, which surprised her. He left at a respectful hour, putting on his hat in the doorway and thanking her in that simple, complete way of his. She stood in the doorway and watched him walk across the dark January grass toward his own lights, and she noticed that he turned once to look back before he rounded the line of bare winter trees, and she was still standing there when he did. She thought January might kill her with its slowness after that. February came in cold and then turned briefly mild, the way Texas February sometimes does, offering a few days of fall spring warmth that makes everyone feel something stirring that they can't quite name. On one of these warm days, Delia was out in her kitchen garden doing the first tentative work of the season, turning the cold earth and pulling the spent roots of last year's vegetables, when she heard boots on the road and looked up and saw Stephen Garrison walking toward her with a deliberateness that told her this was not coincidental. She straightened up and pushed a strand of hair back from her face with the back of her wrist, aware that she was covered in garden dirt and completely unworried about it. He stopped at the garden fence and looked at what she was doing. "The soil here is good," he said. "Better than it looks," she agreed. "What are you planting?" He asked, nodding at the turned earth. She told him, sweet potatoes again, beans, summer squash, and she was thinking of trying peppers this year if she could get the seeds. He listened, and then without asking he let himself through the gate and picked up the spare fork that was leaning against the fence post and began turning the earth alongside her, and she let him, because it felt natural, and because the garden was large for one person, and because she liked having him there. They worked in companionable silence for a good while. The fall-spring air was warm on her face, and the earth smelled rich and dark and full of possibility, and she was aware of him working a few feet away with the easy competence of a man who had grown up working land. "I grew peppers in Kentucky," he said eventually. "My mother kept a kitchen garden." "Does she still?" Delia asked, a brief pause. "She died in '63, he said. "The winter." "I am sorry," she said, and meant it simply, without elaboration, which she thought was what he would prefer. "She would have liked this soil," he said. They turned earth until the mild afternoon light began to angle low and gold over the hills, and then they stood back and looked at the turned garden, which was now ready for planting in a way it would have taken Delia another full afternoon to achieve alone. "Thank you," she said. It was not only gardening, he said, and there was just the ghost of something in his voice, a careful echo of her own words from the supper table, and she looked at him and he was looking at her, and the warm February light was between them, and she thought, oh, she was falling in love with him. She had suspected it before, in the way you suspect something that hasn't quite shown itself yet, but standing here in her muddy garden in the fall-spring light, she knew it the way you know a thing when it has finally stepped fully into the light where you can see it clearly. She was falling in love with this quiet, careful man who answered every kindness with a matching one, who fixed what was broken without being asked, who listened to everything she said as if it mattered, who spoke to her son with respect and her cow with patience, and her with something that she now recognized was not mere neighborliness. She did not say any of this. She was not ready to say it, and she was fairly sure he was not ready to hear it. And besides, there was still the small matter of being a widow, 11 months out with a 7-year-old son, and a town that was watching with considerable interest. "Thank you for helping," she said instead, and he nodded and picked up his coat from the fence post and went home, and she stood in the turned earth of her garden and watched him go and permitted herself exactly 1 minute of feeling entirely, helplessly, warmly lost before she went inside to start supper. She told no one, but she noticed, in the weeks that followed, that things had shifted in the way the days moved. Stephen Garrison began to stop by the garden fence when he rode past, occasionally, just to look at the work and exchange a few words. She found that the walk to the mercantile sometimes coincided with his, not by design, or at least not entirely by design, and they would walk together part of the way, and their conversations grew longer and less careful, filling in the edges of each other's histories. She learned that he had fought at Chickamauga and Chattanooga and Sherman's March, things he told her quietly and without drama, and that the war had taken from him two close friends, and something else he did not name but which she thought she could identify by the shape of the silence around it. A particular kind of lost innocence that men who had seen certain things never entirely recovered. She learned that he had a gift for carpentry, and had been improving the Breck house systematically from the outside in, starting with the roof and working toward the interior, and that he expected to have it properly livable by spring. She learned that he was 34 years old to her 26, a gap that felt like nothing in practice, and that he preferred coffee to whiskey and horses to cattle and quiet to noise, all of which she found entirely congenial. He learned, she supposed, the corresponding things about her. She did not censor herself the way she had at first. She told him about the year after Caleb's death, the practical disasters of it, the fence that fell down in January and the roof that leaked through February, and the calf Agnes had that didn't survive, all of it on top of the grief, and how she had simply dealt with it item by item the way you do when you have no other choice. She told him about Thomas's questions, the ones she couldn't answer, about where Papa was now, exactly, and whether it hurt, and she told him these things without weeping, which she was proud of, and he listened without flinching, which she valued enormously. March came, and with it the real spring, blowing in warm and rain-wet and full of the smell of cedar and new grass. Harlan Creek turned green overnight, it seemed, and the creek ran high and musical from the winter rains, and Delia's kitchen garden erupted with the first green shoots of things she had planted, and the world felt, in the way only spring can make it feel, as if it had decided to keep going after all. On a Saturday in the middle of March, Stephen Garrison asked her to walk with him. He came to the door, knocked, and when she opened it he said, "Would you walk with me to the creek?" Simple, direct, his eyes steady on her face. "Thomas," she called, and Thomas appeared with dirt on his knees and a hopeful expression. "You may come or stay," she told him. Thomas looked at Stephen Garrison, and then at his mother, and then, with a social acuity that she had not expected from a 7-year-old, said, "I am going to stay and see if I can catch the mouse that lives under the barn." He disappeared. Stephen Garrison and Delia looked at each other. "Well then," she said, and took her shawl from the hook. They walked the quarter-mile to the creek in the warm spring afternoon, through grass that was calf-high and brilliantly green, with the cedar trees throwing their sharp, sweet smell across everything, and the mockingbirds making their indiscriminate, ambitious racket from every high branch. She had walked this way 100 times, 1,000 times, but it felt entirely different walking beside him, the distance between them just enough to be proper and just close enough to be aware of. At the creek bank they stopped and stood at the edge of the water. The creek was running clear and fast over the white limestone, the way it always ran in spring, and on the other bank a stand of willow trees was just coming into leaf, the new growth, that pale, hopeful green of things just beginning. "I want to tell you something," Stephen Garrison said. She waited. He turned to look at her, and there was something different about his face, something that had come forward that was usually held back, and she felt her heart move. "I came here to build something," he said. "I meant a house, a farm, something to show for what I had survived." He paused. He was looking at her with those steady dark eyes, and he was, she thought, choosing his words with particular care. "I did not expect the other part." "What other part?" she asked, though she thought she knew. "You," he said. It was a very simple word, and it landed with the force of something much larger. "I did not expect you, Mrs. Slater. The soup was enough to undo any plan I had for simplicity." She looked at the creek for a moment because she needed somewhere to put her eyes that was not directly at him. "Delia," she said. "What?" "My name," she said. "I would like it if you called me Delia." Another pause longer. "Delia," he said, and the way he said it, careful and deliberate as if he were setting something valuable down in exactly the right place, made her look back at him. "I did not expect you either," she said. "I left that soup because I heard you coughing and I thought someone ought to do something. I did not think it would lead to this." "To this," he repeated, and there was something questioning in it. She met his eyes. "To caring about you," she said quietly. "To wanting you to come to Sunday supper and walk to the creek with me and be here." She stopped, because she had apparently run out of her usual careful management of herself. "I am sorry if that is too much." "It is exactly the right amount," he said, very quietly. They stood at the edge of the spring creek in the warm afternoon and looked at each other, and then he reached out and took her hand slowly, giving her every opportunity to stop him if she chose to, and she did not choose to. His hand was warm and rough-palmed, and it held hers with that same careful intentionality he brought to everything, and she felt something settle in her chest, something that had been braced against difficulty for a long time, that had been holding itself tightly in preparation for the next thing that needed to be dealt with, settle and release, and simply rest. They stood there for a long time, holding hands by the spring creek in the cedar-scented afternoon, and neither of them said anything more because nothing more was needed. Thomas, when they returned to find him not actually chasing any mouse but sitting on the porch steps with a suspiciously innocent expression, looked at their faces and smiled so wide it creased his whole face. "I knew it," he said. "You knew nothing," Delia told him, but she was smiling when she said it, and she saw Stephen Garrison smile too, fully, for the first time, and it transformed his face in a way that made her feel she had been given something extraordinary. The spring moved forward with a sweet, unhurried momentum. Stephen Garrison came to supper regularly now, on Sundays and sometimes Wednesdays, and he and Thomas developed a friendship that moved by its own logic, the boy following him around while he worked, asking questions at volume, and Stephen answering with a patience that Delia watched with something that she realized one afternoon was love. Fully, simply, that was what it was. She loved him. The realization did not arrive with drama. It arrived the way spring does, so gradually that you cannot mark the exact moment, but you look up one day, and the world has entirely changed. She had been worried in the back of her mind about the town, about Mabel Hadley and Clara Whitmore and the others who watched and formed opinions. She had worried that being seen to be involved with a man, and specifically a man who had fought for the Union in a state where many still felt the complicated bitterness of the war's aftermath, would cost her something, some social standing, some neighborly goodwill she needed. What actually happened was smaller and more manageable than she had feared. There were a few women who drew in slightly, who were civil but not warm when she passed them on the way to the mercantile. There was Reverend Cross, who stopped by one afternoon in April with an air of pastoral concern and asked, in careful language, about the nature of her relationship with the Garrison man. And Delia looked him directly in the eye and said that Stephen Garrison was a good man and a good neighbor, and that she respected him greatly. And the Reverend, who was not a bad man, just a cautious one, nodded and left apparently satisfied, or at least persuaded not to press the matter. What she had not expected was the other thing, which was that several people in town extended a kind of tentative welcome to Stephen Garrison that she had not seen before. Tom Hadley at the butcher shop, who had lost a brother in the war and still held his feelings about it close, made a point of shaking Stephen's hand one morning in April and inviting him to the quarterly cattlemen's meeting, and Stephen accepted with the quiet seriousness that was characteristic of him. Two of the ranching families to the south, the Coles and the Prathers, who were pragmatic people with more interest in good workers than in wartime grievances, approached him about helping with their spring roundup, and he agreed. Delia watched him slowly, carefully become part of the fabric of Harlan Creek, the way a new piece of fence wire works into the old structure, neither loud nor intrusive, but once in place, obviously right. She asked him one evening in late April when they were sitting on her porch watching the long spring dusk paint the hills purple how he felt about it, about the town. He thought about it for a moment. "There are men here who look at me and see a uniform," he said. "I understand it. I looked at men in blue and men in gray and made judgments that were sometimes wrong. It takes time to see past the war." "Does it bother you?" she asked. "Some," he said honestly. "Less than it did." He looked at her. "Less than it did when I had less reason to stay." She reached over and put her hand over his where it rested on the porch rail. He turned it over and held hers. They watched the last of the light go out of the sky. In May, Stephen Garrison asked her to marry him. He did it in her kitchen garden, where they were staking up the young bean plants, which was not a particularly romantic location but which was, she thought afterward, perfectly characteristic of him. He stood up from where he had been crouching with a handful of stakes, and he looked at her with that direct, unguarded look that she had come to understand was what he looked like when he was being completely himself. "I would like to ask you something," he said. "Ask," she said. "Will you marry me?" Direct, unornamented. His eyes steady and serious, and behind the seriousness something that she recognized as hope carefully held. She looked at him in the May garden with the beans growing up around them, and the cedar smell on the warm air, and the sound of Thomas somewhere behind the barn making an extremely loud noise that was probably Thomas being happy. And she thought about what she knew of this man. She thought about the firewood and the fence posts, and the steadiness of him and the Sunday suppers and the creek walk and all of it, every gesture and every word and every careful silence, and she thought about how she felt about all of it. "Yes," she said. He let out a breath that she thought he might have been holding for quite some time, and he crossed the few feet of garden between them, and he kissed her for the first time, briefly and very gently, the way he did things when he wanted to be sure he was not taking more than was given. She put her hand flat against his chest and felt his heart beating fast, which moved her considerably, and she kissed him back. Thomas appeared around the corner of the barn at this exact moment, as if called by some seventh sense, and stopped dead. "Are you getting married?" he demanded. They separated. Delia looked at her son. Stephen looked at Delia. "That depends on whether you have any objection," Stephen said to Thomas. Thomas considered this with the gravity of someone taking a duty seriously. Then he said, "Can we get a dog?" Stephen Garrison looked at Delia. Something in the corner of his mouth moved. "I do not see why not," he said. "Then I have no objection," Thomas said, and walked back around the barn with great dignity. They were married in June, on a Saturday, in the small church in Harlan Creek with its whitewashed walls and wooden pews, and the windows open to the summer air. Delia wore a dress she had made from pale blue calico, and she carried wildflowers that Thomas had picked for her that morning with great enthusiasm, a somewhat chaotic bouquet of bluebonnets and Indian paintbrush, and a few other things she could not entirely identify. Stephen wore his best clothes, which were not fancier than was practical but which were clean and carefully pressed, and he stood at the front of the church with a stillness that she knew, by now, was not nerves but the way he looked when he was feeling something deeply. Reverend Cross performed the ceremony. Most of the town attended. Mabel Hadley cried, which surprised everyone including Mabel. Tom Hadley shook Stephen's hand afterward with a firmness that seemed to seal something between them. Clara Whitmore kissed Delia on the cheek and whispered, "You look wonderful," and meant both more and less than the words. Thomas sat in the front pew with his hair slicked down and his best shirt on, and a look of profound satisfaction, as if he had managed something quite complex and was entitled to be pleased about it. The wedding supper was held at the Hadleys' place, which was the largest in town, and there was a fiddle player from 2 counties over who played reels and waltzes until the stars came out above the hill country, and the fireflies rose from the summer grass. Delia danced with Thomas and then with Reverend Cross and then with Stephen, and dancing with Stephen was quiet and close and warm, and he held her with the same careful intentionality he brought to everything, and she leaned her head against his shoulder for a moment and closed her eyes and thought, "Here. This is where I am supposed to be. They went home together to the Breck house, which was Stephen's house now, which was their house. He had finished the interior through the spring, and it was good and solid and well made. The way everything he did was good and solid and well made. 2 bedrooms and a proper kitchen, and a parlor with a fieldstone fireplace, and a porch that ran along the front facing east to catch the morning light. He had built Thomas a proper bed frame from cedar, and Thomas had inspected it with the satisfaction of a structural engineer. He had installed shelves in the kitchen for Delia's preserves and herbs and her line of colored glass bottles, and she had put them up on her first visit after the installation and stood back and thought, yes. They settled into the house and into each other with a naturalness that still sometimes surprised her. She had wondered, in the weeks before the wedding, whether the reality of daily life together would feel different from the careful, deliberate courtship, whether the particular golden quality of those months would survive proximity. What she found instead was that ordinary life with Stephen Garrison was better than she had imagined it would be. He was not a talkative man, but he was present. He was there in the mornings when she came to the kitchen, already with the stove lit, and the coffee started because he had been up an hour earlier working in the barn or the yard. He was there in the evenings at the table with his small repair projects, a boot that needed resoling, a harness fitting that needed adjusting, something always patient and practical in his hands. He read in the evenings, which she loved, and they had developed the habit of reading near each other by lamplight in a comfortable silence that felt more intimate, somehow, than most conversation. He was patient with Thomas in a way that did not try to replace Caleb but made room for something new, and Thomas, who had a child's accurate instinct for the genuine, responded to this with an open-hearted trust that sometimes made Delia's eyes sting. She watched them together in the yard, Stephen teaching Thomas to properly split kindling, the 2 of them at the fence rail watching Agnes with the identical evaluating expression, Stephen sitting on the porch listening to Thomas read aloud from his school book with the same complete attention he gave everything, and she thought, this is family. This is what this is. They got the dog in July. It was Thomas's negotiated condition, satisfied at last. A young cattle dog, blue-gray with 1 brown eye and 1 pale eye, who Thomas named Biscuit and who immediately appointed himself guardian of everything on the property including Agnes, who was unimpressed. The summer was full and warm and good. Stephen expanded the kitchen garden and built a better chicken coop and brought in 3 more hens, so they had eggs to spare and began selling the surplus to the mercantile. He worked the spring roundup for the Cole and Prather ranches and came home in the evenings with the particular tired satisfaction of a man who had done hard work well. He began to find his place in the rhythms of the community more easily, and Delia watched the town slowly calibrate itself around the fact of him, finding the places where his particular skills and steadiness could be useful and valuing them there. In August, she told him she was expecting a child. She told him in the evening, at the kitchen table, with the lamp burning and Biscuit asleep by the door and Thomas already in bed and the summer night insects singing loud outside. She told him simply, watching his face. He was very still for a moment. Then he reached across the table and took both her hands in both of his, and he looked at her with an expression that she had never quite seen on his face before, something fully open, without any of the usual careful reserve, something that was purely, simply joy. "Delia," he said, and could not apparently find anything to follow that, but he did not need to. She squeezed his hands. "Are you pleased?" She asked, though she could see perfectly well that he was. "More than I know how to say," he told her honestly. Thomas found out at breakfast the next morning when Delia told him, and he received the news with a 7-year-old's practical curiosity. When, how big could it be a brother, and would the baby need to share his room? And if so, could Biscuit sleep in his room as a trade? These questions were dealt with one at a time. The pregnancy moved through the fall and into the winter in a way that was, physically, easier than her pregnancy with Thomas had been. She was 30 weeks in when the first anniversary of their meeting came around, which she calculated privately and said nothing about. Only on that particular November morning she left soup on his side of the breakfast table instead of at the hearth, a small private joke, and he looked at it, and then at her, and his mouth curved fully into the smile she still found disarming. "You remembered," he said. "It was a notable occasion," she said. "For me as well," he said. She had not known it could be like this. She had been happy with Caleb, in the solid, practical way of young people building something together. But this was different, had a different quality to it, something richer for having been chosen at an age and a point in life where both of them knew more about what they were choosing. She loved him in a way that was adult and clear-eyed and completely certain, and when she told him so, on a cold December evening by the fire while the hills outside were frosted white, he held her close and said, very quietly against her hair, that he could not account for having deserved this. And she said that she was fairly sure deserving had nothing to do with it and they had better be grateful and go on from there. And she felt him laugh, which was still one of her favorite things. Their son was born in February of 1876, 3 days before the fall-spring arrived that year. He came into the world in the bedroom of the Breck house in the small hours of the morning, with the midwife, Mrs. Aldine Marsh, presiding and Stephen present, which was not the universal custom, but which Delia had not been willing to negotiate, and which Mrs. Marsh accepted with the pragmatic flexibility of a woman who had seen too much of life to be rigid about conventions. The baby was healthy and loud, which last quality was immediately apparent, and he had Stephen's dark eyes and Delia's determined jaw and a full head of dark hair. Stephen held him with the same careful intentionality he brought to everything, as if holding something of the greatest possible value, and looked at Delia over the baby's head with an expression that she thought she would carry in her memory for the rest of her life. "Henry," she said. It had been her father's name. "Henry," Stephen agreed quietly. "Henry Garrison." Henry Garrison came home to a household that received him with various degrees of enthusiasm. Thomas, aged 8, was cautiously delighted and immediately appointed himself authority on all Henry-related matters, which he communicated to everyone whether they asked or not. Biscuit circled the cradle for 3 days with an air of deep concern before deciding that the baby was apparently going to remain and that guarding it was now part of his responsibilities. Agnes, informed of the new addition, offered no opinion. The spring of 1876 was soft and kind. Henry slept in his cradle near the kitchen stove through the cool mornings and was carried on Delia's hip through the afternoons while she worked the garden or tended the chickens or sat on the porch with him tucked against her chest in the warm sun. He was a contented baby, once he was warm and fed, and he watched the world with Stephen's particular steady attention, as if he were cataloging it all for later. Stephen was tender with him in a way that continued to disarm her. He was not demonstrative by nature, not given to extravagant display, but with Henry he was gentle without self-consciousness, talking to him in the low, steady voice he used for animals, and for things he was trying to understand, holding him in the evenings with a natural ease that made something warm bloom in Delia's chest every single time. In the summer, Thomas learned to ride properly and helped with the smaller ranch work, riding out with Stephen on weekend mornings, and coming home with dirty clothes and the particular satisfied exhaustion of a boy who has been doing real things. He was growing fast, Thomas, shooting up into the angular length of early boyhood, his face losing its baby roundness and taking on the angles of the person he was going to be. He was smart and curious and sometimes exasperating and entirely, wholly himself, and Delia loved him with the fierce, helpless love of a mother who has also been his only parent through hard times and knows the exact weight of that. She noticed one August evening that Thomas called Stephen Pa without preamble or announcement in the middle of a sentence about something else entirely, and Stephen answered without missing a beat, and neither of them seemed to register it as significant, though Delia went very still for a moment and then very deliberately kept herself busy so that no one would see her face. She told Stephen that night. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I noticed." "Are you glad?" she asked. "Yes," he said. "More than I can say, again." She leaned into him where they sat together on the porch in the warm summer dark, and he put his arm around her, and they sat and listened to the night sounds of the hill country, the creek running, the insects, the far sound of a coyote on the hills, and the soft breathing of Henry asleep in his cradle just inside the open door. "I did not know," Stephen said after a while, "when I came here, what it was I was building toward. I thought I knew what I wanted: land, quiet, something steady." "And instead," she asked. "Instead," he said, "all of that and everything else." She tilted her head up to look at him. He was looking at the dark hills with that expression of his that was not guarded anymore, not with her, that was just fully, openly him. "The soup," she said. He looked at her. "The soup," he confirmed, and his mouth curved. "And the firewood," she said. "And the firewood," he said. "And now all of this," she said, gesturing at the dark yard, the lit windows, the sleeping house, the whole improbable beautiful thing that had grown from a covered crock left on a doorstep by a woman who had told herself she was only being neighborly. "And now all of this," he said, and kissed her temple, and she closed her eyes and leaned into the warmth of him. The town of Harlan Creek continued on in its small, determined way. The years settled in their steady rhythms, seasons turning and people coming and going and life doing what it does, which is to surprise you with what is possible. The Slater land and the Garrison land, the quarter-mile between them that had once been the distance between two solitary people, had been absorbed into one working farm that Stephen ran with the methodical competence that characterized everything he did. They expanded the garden and put in an orchard in 1877, apple and peach trees that would not give real fruit for 3 years, but that Thomas was already monitoring with proprietary interest. They added 2 milk cows to the operation, which Agnes regarded as a personal affront, and a proper flock of chickens, and a second horse for Thomas, who had by age 9 been riding Stephen's big bay with sufficient skill to have earned his own mount. The community of Harlan Creek, which had watched Stephen Garrison with wariness in the beginning, had by 1877 arrived at the kind of settled regard that small communities extend to people who prove themselves useful and reliable. He was on the volunteer fire committee and helped build the new schoolhouse annex in the spring of that year, and when a family named Hartwell lost their barn to lightning, Stephen organized the rebuilding effort with a brisk efficiency that made Harlan Creek realize, somewhat belatedly, that he was a man they were fortunate to have. The injustice of his early treatment by some in town, the coldness extended because of his uniform and his history, was something that settled into the past slowly but incompletely, the way such things do. There were still men in Harlan Creek who held their distance, who had lost too much to the war to be entirely easy with a former Union soldier. Stephen did not press against this. He let it be what it was and worked beside it and around it, and in time the simple fact of who he had proven himself to be in the years since arriving began to do the quiet, patient work that good character does when given enough time. Delia watched all of this with the clear-eyed attention that had always been her particular gift. She watched her husband build himself into the fabric of their community and their family and their life, and she was proud of him in a way that was specific and informed, because she knew exactly what it cost him and what it had required, and what he had chosen over and over again in the small, unremarkable moments of ordinary days. She was also, she knew, happier than she had understood was still available to her in the winter she had spent holding herself together with pure stubborn will after Caleb's death. She had not given up on happiness exactly, but she had stopped expecting it in any particular form, had decided that contentment was enough, and that asking for more was greedy. She had been wrong about that, and she was glad to have been wrong. Henry grew. He was a solid, cheerful child, more outwardly demonstrative than his father and more patient than his mother, a combination that charmed everyone he encountered. By the time he was 2, he followed Thomas everywhere with an adoration that Thomas occasionally found overwhelming and most often found entirely satisfying, because Thomas had Caleb's generosity of spirit along with his mother's sharpness, and the combination made him a natural protector. In the fall of 1877, Delia told Stephen she was expecting again. This time he was not still for a moment first. This time he simply reached for her immediately and held her close in the kitchen where she had told him, and she felt him breathe, a long, slow breath, and then he said against her hair, "You have given me everything." "We have given each other everything," she corrected him, because she was a precise woman. He pulled back enough to look at her face. "Yes," he said, "that is exactly right." Their daughter was born in March of 1878, and she arrived with a full set of opinions about everything, which she expressed loudly and consistently, and which charmed her father completely. They named her Me, for Stephen's mother Mary, and for the warmth of May, which was the month Delia associated with the garden and with beginning things. Me Garrison was from the very first day a person of clear and specific preferences. She preferred to be held facing outward so she could see what was happening. She preferred Thomas to carry her over either parent, which Thomas bore with a mixture of pride and suffering, and she preferred Biscuit above all other earthly companions, which Biscuit appeared to find entirely correct and appropriate. By spring of 1878, the Garrison farm was a going concern in every sense. The orchard had given its first real fruit the previous fall, a modest crop of apples that Delia had put up in preserves and pies, and that Stephen had stored carefully in the root cellar. The kitchen garden was the best in the county, by general consensus, and Delia had begun selling produce at the monthly market in addition to the eggs. They were not wealthy, but they were deeply solvent, which in the hill country of Texas in 1878 was everything. Clara Whitmore retired from the schoolhouse that spring, and there was a question about who would take over. The parents with children at the school met to discuss it at the church one Wednesday evening, and Delia went, and in the course of the conversation someone mentioned, without thinking too much about it, that Delia Garrison had a better education than anyone in the room, her father having been a proper school teacher, and perhaps she might consider it. She brought this home to Stephen that evening. He listened. He poured coffee. He sat down across from her. "What do you want to do?" he asked. She had expected him to have an opinion. She had expected, perhaps, some concern about the work of it with me still an infant and the farm demanding. Instead, he was asking what she wanted. "I think I want to do it," she said slowly. "Part-time, 3 mornings a week, I could take me." "Then do it," he said. "You do not mind." He looked at her steadily. "I want you to have what uses you fully," he said. "You are wasted doing only what the farm requires." She looked at him across the kitchen table in the lamplight, this quiet, careful man who had once left firewood on her doorstep without a word, and she thought for the 100th time that she had no adequate language for what she felt about him. "Thank you," she said. "It is only the truth," he said. She took the teaching position. 3 mornings a week she packed me into her carrying basket and walked Thomas to school, which was now her school, and taught the children of Harlan Creek their letters and their arithmetic and a little of the Latin her father had taught her, which the children found either fascinating or deeply confusing in roughly equal measure. Me sat in her basket and then on a blanket and then, as she grew, on a small stool at the side of the classroom, and listened to everything with those clear eyes that were her father's, and occasionally contributed to the lesson in her own language, which the children found entertaining. Thomas thrived at school and was, Delia had to be honest with herself, showing every sign of being significantly smarter than the curriculum she was offering could accommodate. She told Stephen this one evening with a mixture of pride and worry, and he said that when Thomas was old enough they should talk to him about the university in Austin, which was a serious and forward-thinking suggestion for 1878, and which told her, not for the first time, that Stephen Garrison's ambitions for the people he loved were quiet but not small. The autumn of 1878 was golden and long and warm, the kind of Texas fall that is so beautiful it seems deliberate, as if the land is making a case for itself. The mesquite turned pale gold, and the creek ran low and clear over the white limestone, and the hills in the evening were the color of embers. Henry, now 2.5 and fully ambulatory and opinionated, conducted a campaign of thorough investigation of every corner of the farm that kept both his parents in a state of vigilant alertness. Me, at 7 months, had discovered that she could make a particular sound that caused Biscuit to come running from wherever he was in the yard, and she exercised this ability constantly and with unrepentant glee. On a warm October evening, Delia was sitting on the front porch watching the last of the sun leave the sky, me sleeping in the basket beside her, when Stephen came and sat in the chair next to her. He had been working in the barn and he smelled of horses and clean work, and he sat with the settled tiredness of someone who had used their body well in the day. They watched the sky go from orange to violet to deep blue together without speaking, the way they often did, in the comfortable wordlessness of two people who have long since stopped needing to fill silence to feel connected. "I was thinking," Stephen said after a while. "Tell me," she said. "I was thinking about the day I first saw you in the road with Agnes," he said, "and how I had told myself for 2 months that I would keep my distance, that I had come here to work and build and not to complicate things. And then Agnes complicated things," she said. "Agnes was the instrument," he said. "You were the complication." She looked at him. He was looking at the dark hills, a slight smile at the corner of his mouth, which was still one of the most affecting things she had ever seen. "What were you thinking about all of this?" she asked. He turned to look at her. In the blue evening light his face was quiet and certain and completely open. "That I would walk back through every winter morning of my life," he said, "every hard thing, every loss, if it brought me to that road at that moment. That I am grateful for all of it, including the parts that were difficult, because they were the path to this." She held that for a moment. "The soup," she said softly. "The soup," he said, "and the firewood and everything after." She reached over and took his hand, and he held hers with that warm, deliberate grip that had not changed in 3.5 years, and that she thought she could recognize in the dark at the end of the world. Me stirred in her basket and made a small sound, and from inside the house came the sound of Henry calling for his supper, and from the barn the sound of Thomas talking to the horses the way he always did in the evenings, a comfortable, steady sound that told her he was happy and occupied. The fire in the house cast its warm light through the open door onto the porch boards, and the October dark was soft around them, and the hill country spread out to the horizon in its ancient, patient beauty, and Delia Garrison sat on her porch with her husband's hand in hers, and listened to the sounds of her full, improbable, absolutely particular life. And she was, down to the marrow of her bones, grateful. She had left soup on a stranger's doorstep on a cold November morning, because she heard him coughing and could not leave a person alone with that. She had walked home without knocking, because something told her he needed to choose. And in the morning there had been firewood, and in the firewood there had been an answer, and in the answer there had been a beginning, and from the beginning all of this had grown, the way things grow when the ground is right and the season turns and someone has the sense to plant something and then stand back and let it take. She looked at Stephen Garrison in the evening dark, and he looked back at her, and between them was the whole accumulated weight and grace of everything they had chosen together. And it was more than enough. It was more than she had known to ask for. It was everything. The next morning she got up before Thomas and before Henry's first cry, and she went to the kitchen and built the fire and put on the coffee, and she made a pot of soup from the leftover ham and the dried beans and the turnips from the garden, the same soup she had always made, the first soup, her mother's recipe, and she set 2 bowls on the table and waited. Stephen came in from the barn because he was always up first, and he stopped in the kitchen doorway and looked at the table. He looked at her. She gestured at his bowl. He sat down across from her. He looked at the soup. He looked up. "What is the occasion?" he asked. "4 years ago this week," she said, "I left soup on your doorstep." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I have been meaning to thank you properly for that." "Have you?" "Every day," he said. "I have been thanking you every day." She looked at him across the kitchen table with the morning fire behind her and the steam rising from the soup between them and the sounds of her children beginning to wake in the rooms above, and she thought, "Yes, every day, that is exactly it. Eat your soup," she said, "before it gets cold." He smiled at her, that full, rare, transforming smile, and picked up his spoon. Outside, the November morning was just beginning to lighten over the hill country hills, and the creek would be running dark and cold between its limestone banks, and the mesquite trees would be bare and silver with frost, and the whole wide, beautiful, difficult world was out there doing what it always had. But here in this kitchen with this man and this soup and this life, Delia Garrison was home. And she would not have changed a single step of the road that brought her here. Not the soup and not the firewood, not the cough through the door and not the hand held by the creek, not the wedding and not the children, and not any of the ordinary extraordinary days that had added up, quietly and without fanfare, into a life she had not known enough to dream of, but which had, with patience and courage and a little neighborly soup, managed to find her anyway. Henry's voice rose from upstairs with the specific pitch that meant he was awake and wanted everyone to know it. And Me's lower, more measured tones joined in, and Thomas's feet hit the floor above with a thump that shook the ceiling slightly. And Biscuit lifted his head from his place by the fire and thumped his tail against the floor planks. And Stephen Garrison looked at his wife across the breakfast table with those dark, steady eyes. And the fire crackled, and the soup steamed. And the November morning light came in through the kitchen windows and lay across the table like a gift, like every morning was, like every morning had always been.